For 2 years, it was as if Joseph Balderas had vanished from the face of the earth. No emergency call. No signs of a struggle. No trail leading into the wilderness. Nothing. Then, deep inside Alaska's remote backcountry, searchers made a discovery that transformed a missing person case into something far more disturbing. Joseph's remains had finally been found. But one detail immediately stopped investigators in their tracks. His skull was discovered upside down, lodged inside a decaying tree stump, separated from the rest of his remains. To some, it looked impossible. To others, deliberate. And as questions began to pile up, many found themselves looking toward a dark legend that had haunted Alaska for generations. A legend whispered about in isolated communities. A legend connected to disappearances, strange encounters, and people who never found their way home. This is the unsettling mystery of Joseph Balderas. Long before Joseph's disappearance, another mystery was already woven into Alaska's history. To understand why some people believe the two stories are connected, we need to travel back more than a century. Back to a place known as Thomas Bay. Hidden among glaciers, mountains, and dense forests, Thomas Bay has carried a reputation for strangeness for generations. During the late 1800s, as the Alaskan gold rush attracted fortune seekers from across the continent, countless prospectors ventured into regions few people had ever explored. Among them was a man known simply as Charlie. Like many others, Charlie dreamed of finding gold. He traveled deep into southern Alaska, pushing through dangerous terrain in search of hidden deposits rumored to exist beyond the mountains. But according to his account, what he encountered there had nothing to do with gold. One foggy day near Thomas Bay, Charlie spotted several figures standing motionless on a distant ridge. At first, he assumed they were other prospectors. Then he noticed something strange. The figures were enormous. Far larger than any normal person. They stood upright like humans, but their bodies appeared covered in dark, matted fur. Where patches of fur were missing, he claimed the skin looked scarred and diseased. Most disturbing of all, they were staring directly at him. Charlie later said the creatures never broke eye contact. For several seconds, neither side moved. Then everything changed. The figures suddenly rushed toward him. Charlie turned and ran. Panic took over. He sprinted through the wilderness as fast as he could, convinced something terrifying was chasing him. Behind him, he reported hearing screams echoing through the forest. The sound seemed to grow closer with every passing moment. How Charlie escaped remains unclear. But according to those who knew him later in life, the experience left permanent scars. Whenever Thomas Bay was mentioned, he reportedly became visibly uncomfortable. He rarely spoke about what happened. And when he did, it was only briefly. Whatever he saw that day, he never forgot it. But Charlie's story wasn't unique. For generations, Alaska's indigenous Tlingit communities have shared warnings about mysterious beings said to inhabit isolated parts of the wilderness. Among the most famous is a creature known as the Kushtaka. Descriptions vary depending on the story being told, but many traditions describe the Kushtaka as a powerful shapeshifter associated with remote forests, rivers, and coastal regions. According to legend, it can imitate voices. It can mimic sounds. And it can lure travelers away from safety. Some view these stories as folklore. Others see them as cultural memories passed down through generations. Whatever the explanation, many local families have treated the warnings seriously for centuries. Elders have long advised people to avoid certain locations entirely. Most outsiders dismiss such stories as legends. Campfire tales. Ancient myths. But in 2016, a real-life disappearance would force many people to revisit those old warnings. Because unlike Charlie, one man entered Alaska's wilderness and never came back. His name was Joseph Balderas. And his case remains one of Alaska's most haunting mysteries. Joseph Balderas was not the kind of person who took unnecessary risks. Friends described him as thoughtful, intelligent, and exceptionally prepared. Born in Texas in 1980, Joseph built a reputation as someone who stayed calm under pressure and planned ahead whenever possible. People trusted him. Co-workers respected him. He wasn't reckless. In fact, he was exactly the kind of person least likely to disappear without a trace. In 2014, Joseph relocated to Alaska and settled in the city of Nome. He worked as a law clerk and quickly embraced the lifestyle that drew so many people north. When he wasn't working, he spent his time outdoors. Fishing, kayaking, hiking, exploring remote wilderness areas. Alaska wasn't intimidating to him. It felt like home. Even more importantly, his future appeared bright. He had a promising career, a loving fiancée, and plans for the years ahead. Nothing suggested that within a short time, his name would become attached to one of the state's most baffling disappearance cases. Then came June 24, 2016. A Friday that seemed completely ordinary. Joseph finished work, said goodbye to co-workers, climbed into his truck, and drove away. No one realized it would be the last time they would ever see him alive. Before leaving, Joseph mentioned plans to go fishing near mile 44 along the Nome Council Highway. The location was remote but familiar territory for someone with his experience. Yet before heading out, he reportedly made a comment that would later send chills through everyone who heard it. "If I'm not back by June 28, call the police." At the time, the statement sounded responsible. Alaska's wilderness can be unforgiving. Experienced outdoorsmen often leave detailed plans behind. But after Joseph vanished, those words took on a far darker meaning. Why June 28? Why that exact date? Was it simply a precaution? Or did Joseph have a reason to believe something could go wrong? No one knows. What investigators do know is that Joseph left prepared. He carried supplies. He had survival equipment. He owned a firearm. And he possessed years of outdoor experience. If anyone seemed capable of handling Alaska's wilderness, it was Joseph Balderas. Yet within days, he would disappear without leaving behind a single answer. By Monday morning, concern was spreading rapidly. Joseph never showed up for work. At first, co-workers assumed there had been a delay. Maybe he stayed out longer than expected. Maybe he had poor cell service. But as the hours passed, those explanations stopped making sense. Joseph wasn't the type of person who vanished without warning. If plans changed, he called. If he was running late, people knew about it. His silence was completely out of character. Authorities were contacted almost immediately. Investigators drove toward the area where Joseph had planned to fish. What they found only deepened the mystery. His truck sat abandoned near mile 44. Cold. Unlocked. Empty. Inside were personal belongings and fishing-related equipment. But there was no sign of Joseph. No indication of where he had gone. No obvious evidence of violence. No footprints leading investigators toward an answer. Just an abandoned vehicle sitting beside one of the loneliest stretches of road in Alaska. Several people involved in the search later admitted they felt uneasy from the moment they arrived. Something about the scene didn't feel right. Yet nobody could explain why. Search operations began immediately. And what followed became one of the largest search efforts the region had seen in years. State troopers joined the operation. Volunteer rescue teams arrived. Search dogs were deployed. Helicopters swept across the landscape. Aircraft scanned vast sections of wilderness from above. Every available resource seemed focused on one goal. Find Joseph Balderas. But day after day, searchers found nothing. No clothing. No campsite. No fishing gear. No signs of injury. No trail. No evidence that Joseph had ever been there at all. It was as though the wilderness had swallowed him whole. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Search teams continued pushing into difficult terrain, refusing to give up. Still, there were no answers. Eventually, official search operations were suspended. But Joseph's family refused to stop looking. They simply could not accept the idea that an experienced outdoorsman had vanished so completely. People get lost. People leave clues. Joseph had left neither. And then, 2 years later, the case suddenly exploded back to life. In 2018, a group of tourists accidentally wandered away from a designated route while exploring a heavily wooded area. The location was dense, overgrown, and difficult to navigate. The kind of place most visitors would never think to enter. While moving through the vegetation, they noticed something unusual partially hidden beneath leaves and debris. A backpack. Nearby was a weathered hat. The discovery seemed ordinary at first. But when authorities examined the items, everything changed. The belongings were identified as Joseph's. For the first time in 2 years, investigators finally had a lead. Search teams returned to the location and began carefully examining the surrounding area. What they uncovered next would raise even more questions than Joseph's disappearance itself. Because hidden among the trees were human remains. The first confirmed evidence of what had happened to Joseph Balderas. And the way those remains were found made little sense. Scattered across the area were fragments of bone. Pieces of ribs. Part of a leg. Nearby lay a pair of weathered pants. But investigators immediately noticed something strange. The belt had been undone. The buttons were open. The pants appeared partially removed. Why? No one could say. Some believed Joseph may have been examining an injury. Others suggested confusion caused by exposure or a medical emergency. But there was no clear evidence supporting any single explanation. Then searchers found the skull. And the mystery took an even darker turn. Approximately 12 feet away from the other remains stood a decaying tree stump. Inside a crack near the top was a human skull. Upside down. Not buried. Not hidden beneath soil. Not scattered naturally across the landscape. Positioned inside the stump. To many observers, the placement appeared deliberate. Almost staged. Photographs of the recovery site fueled endless speculation. How had the skull ended up there? Could an animal have moved it? Could weather somehow explain its position? Or had another person been present after Joseph died? The questions came quickly. The answers never did. Forensic testing confirmed the remains belonged to Joseph Balderas. But determining exactly how he died proved far more difficult. Investigators found no clear evidence of a gunshot wound. No definitive signs of a fatal animal attack. No obvious cause of death that explained the entire scene. Instead of solving the mystery, the discovery only made it more complicated. And perhaps even stranger were the things investigators never found. Joseph's camera was missing. Several personal items remained unaccounted for. Parts of his clothing were gone. Large portions of his skeleton were never recovered. After 2 years of searching, investigators finally had Joseph's remains. Yet they still had no complete story. No timeline. No clear explanation. Only fragments of a puzzle that refused to fit together. As investigators examined every possibility, one question continued to linger over the entire case. Was this simply a tragic accident? Or was something important being overlooked? The official answer would come eventually. But for many people, it would only deepen the mystery. Eventually, investigators reached a conclusion. Officially, Joseph Balderas's death was classified as an accident. But for many people, including members of his family, that explanation never felt complete. Too many questions remained unanswered. How had an experienced outdoorsman disappeared without leaving a meaningful trail? Why were his remains discovered in such an unusual condition? What explained the missing items? And perhaps most troubling of all, how did his skull end up upside down inside a tree stump? Authorities considered a range of possibilities. Alaska's wilderness is among the harshest environments on Earth. A simple injury can become fatal within hours. Weather can change without warning. Terrain can isolate people far from help. Wildlife can scatter remains across vast distances. Any one of those factors, or several combined, could potentially explain parts of the case. But critics argued that none of them explained everything. Joseph had experience. He knew the outdoors. He carried equipment. He understood the risks. If something had gone wrong, why was there virtually no evidence showing what happened during his final hours? Why did search teams fail to locate him despite extensive efforts? And why did the recovery site raise more questions than answers? For Joseph's loved ones, those questions never disappeared. Years later, many still believe important pieces of the story remain missing. As discussions surrounding the case spread online and across Alaska, theories began to emerge. Some suspected foul play. Others believed a tragic accident remained the most likely explanation. But there was another theory, one rooted not in forensic evidence, but in the history and folklore of Alaska itself. The legend of the Kushtaka. For generations, stories about the mysterious being have circulated among indigenous communities throughout southeastern Alaska. Descriptions vary from one account to another. Some portray it as a shapeshifter. Others describe it as something that exists between worlds. According to traditional stories, the Kushtaka is known for leading travelers away from safety, drawing them deeper into isolated wilderness, separating them from familiar paths until escape becomes impossible. Many modern observers view these stories as folklore, cultural traditions passed down through generations. Yet for others, the similarities between those legends and certain unexplained disappearances are difficult to ignore. Joseph entered the wilderness alone. He vanished without a trace. Massive search efforts failed to find him. And when his remains were finally discovered, the scene seemed strangely out of place. To believers, those details echoed stories that had existed long before Joseph's disappearance. Of course, there is absolutely no evidence linking the Kushtaka, or any supernatural force, to what happened. No proof. No verified connection. Only speculation. But sometimes unanswered questions create spaces where legends thrive. And the fewer answers people have, the more powerful those legends become. Perhaps that's what makes Joseph Balderas' story so unsettling. Not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. Most mysteries eventually reach a conclusion. Evidence emerges. Witnesses come forward. Missing pieces are found. Joseph's case never offered that closure. Instead, it remains suspended between explanation and uncertainty. A story caught somewhere between documented fact and unanswered possibility. Joseph was only 36 years old. He had a career he cared about. A future he was actively building. A fiancée waiting for him to return home. Plans that stretched years ahead. Then, in a matter of days, everything changed. His loved ones were left searching for answers. Investigators were left with an incomplete picture. And another disappearance was added to Alaska's long history of unsolved mysteries. Today, the Alaskan wilderness remains exactly as it was when Joseph entered it in June of 2016. Immense. Silent. Ancient. Dense forests still blanket the landscape. Fog still rolls across remote valleys. Rivers continue carving their way through terrain few people will ever see. Somewhere